The sun was a hammer, and the earth was an anvil. And between them, the Wyoming Territory was being beaten into a flat, cracked submission. It was a landscape of endless browns and thirsty grays, stretching out under a white-hot sky that seemed stripped of all mercy. Dust devils spun across the open range like uneasy spirits, dancing in unsteady circles before collapsing back into the dirt from which they were born. There was no sound but the wind. It was a constant, high-pitched whine that cut through the dry creek beds and rattled the brittle sagebrush. Miles from the nearest settlement, a single ranch house stood against the horizon. It was a weathered structure of timber and stone, bleached pale by the relentless seasons. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to withstand a siege of silence. Caleb Morgan rode the southern fence line, his hat pulled low against the glare. The heat rose in shimmering waves off the ground, distorting the distance, making the mountains to the west look like mirages that might vanish if he blinked too long. He sat his horse with the easy, unconscious grace of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. But there was a stiffness in his posture that spoke of old pain. A bullet wound from a war that had ended 15 years ago still throbbed in his hip. A dull and grinding ache that flared whenever a storm was brewing or the riding grew too long. He adjusted his weight in the stirrups, grimacing slightly, but he did not stop. Caleb did not talk about the pain, just as he did not talk about the war, or the years that followed in the chaotic, bloody range conflicts that had scarred the territory. He was a man who had learned that words were often useless things, light as chaff and easily blown away by the wind. He pulled his gelding up alongside a section of fence where the wire had snapped, likely from the violent gusts of the night before. The wire lay coiled like a snake in the dust. Caleb dismounted, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a heavy thud. He worked with gloved hands, stretching the rusted metal, his breathing steady despite the oppressive heat. This was his life, the rhythmic mending of things that were constantly breaking. He was not entirely alone, though he often felt he was. A mile back, Harlan was checking the water levels in the drying creek. Harlan was an aging cowhand, a man whose skin looked like cured leather and whose joints popped louder than a green stick in a fire. He had stuck by Caleb when the other hands drifted off to easier work or bigger payouts from the cattle barons moving in from the east. Caleb finished the splice and mounted up again, riding back to meet the old man. He found Harlan staring into the muddy depression that passed for a creek bed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "It is drying up fast," Harlan said, wiping his mouth with the back of a stained sleeve. Caleb nodded, looking at the cracked earth. "It has been a dry winter." Harlan squinted up at the brutal sun. "We are short-handed and short-lived out here. Caleb, that is the truth of it. The cattle are getting thin. If we do not get rain before the month is out, we will be hauling water from the deep well until our backs break." "We will haul it then," Caleb said. His voice was gravel, rough from disuse. Harlan shook his head, shifting in his saddle. "You are a stubborn son of a gun. Most men would have sold out to the combine by now, took the money and moved somewhere where the wind does not try to peel the skin off your face." "This is my land," Caleb said simply. He turned his horse toward the north, ending the conversation. There was no need to explain it further. The land was hard, cruel, and unforgiving, but it was his. It was the only place that did not ask him to be anything other than what he was. He had buried a brother in this soil. He had bled into it. He would not leave it just because the sky refused to weep rain. In the settlement of Red Creek, a cluster of wooden storefronts and a rough-hewn church huddled together against the vastness of the plains. The heat felt different. It was trapped between the buildings, heavy with the smell of horse manure, sawdust, and unwashed bodies. Inside the Lucky Star Saloon, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer and frying grease. Elena Marquez stood in the narrow, stifling kitchen at the back, scrubbing a heavy iron skillet. She was 24 years old, though her eyes held the weariness of a woman twice that age. Her hair, dark and thick, was pulled back severely from her face, revealing the high cheekbones and amber skin that marked her mixed heritage. Her father had been a Mexican tracker, her mother a woman of the Arapaho people, and in the eyes of Red Creek, that blood mixture made her something less than a citizen. She worked with efficient, brutal movements. The grease burned her knuckles, and the heat of the stove made her dress stick to her back. But she did not slow down. She could hear the murmur of voices from the main room, the clink of glasses, the raucous laughter of men who had spent too long on the trail. Elena wiped her forehead with her forearm, leaving a streak of soot. She knew what they said about her. She heard the whispers when she walked to the well in the morning. The town ladies, with their high collars and parasols, would avert their eyes as if looking at her would stain their souls. They pulled their children closer. The preacher, Reverend Thorne, had once stopped her in the street to tell her that her very existence was a temptation to decent men, as if her poverty and her struggle to survive were sins she had actively chosen. She was the saloon girl, the kitchen help, the woman who, when the winter was hard and the saloon owner cut her wages, had been forced to go upstairs with men whose breath smelled of whiskey and rot. She scrubbed the pan harder, her jaw set. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury for women who had safety, who had fathers and husbands to stand between them and the world. Elena had only herself. Her mother had died crossing the desert when Elena was 12. Her father had disappeared into the mountains a year later and never returned. She had survived hunger, exploitation, and humiliation by building a wall of silence around her heart. A shout came from the front. "Elena, where is that stew?" "Coming," she called back. Her voice was steady, giving nothing away. She ladled the thick gray stew into bowls and carried them out on a tray. The bartender, a thick-necked man named O'Malley, barely looked at her as she passed. He treated her like the broom in the corner or the rag on the bar, something to be used until it fell apart, and then discarded without a second thought. As she set a bowl down in front of a ranch hand, his hand shot out and gripped her wrist. He grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "You are looking pretty today, Elena," he slurred. "Why do you not sit with me?" Elena pulled her arm back, but his grip was like iron. "I am working," she said. "Please let go." The man laughed, looking around at his friends for approval. "Working hard, I bet. How much to stop working and come sit on my lap?" "I have to get back to the kitchen," she said, her voice dropping to a low, tight pitch. O'Malley looked over from the bar. "Let the girl work. Jeb, she is slow enough as it is." The ranch hand laughed again and shoved her away. Elena stumbled but caught her balance, her face burning. She retreated to the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at her wrist. Red marks were already rising where his fingers had dug in. She swallowed the humiliation, tasting the bitterness of it at the back of her throat. It was a familiar taste. It was the taste of her life. It was mid-afternoon when Caleb Morgan rode into Red Creek. He needed supplies, flour, coffee, beans, and ammunition. He tied his horse to the rail outside the general store, patting the animal's neck absent-mindedly. The town was busy. Wagons clattered down the dusty main street, and men stood in clusters on the boardwalks, smoking and trading news. Caleb moved through them like a shadow. He tipped his hat to a woman passing by, but he did not stop to talk. He knew his reputation. To the people of Red Creek, he was a ghost, a relic of a violent past. They knew he had killed men in the range wars. They knew he lived alone on that desolate ranch, and they found his solitude unnatural. He walked past the saloon, intending to head toward the livery stable first to check on a price for grain. As he passed the narrow alley that ran behind the Lucky Star, he heard a scuffle and a sharp intake of breath. Caleb stopped. He did not want to get involved. He never wanted to get involved. But the sound came again, the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the dirt. He turned and walked into the alley. A man was standing over a woman who had fallen into the dust. It was the ranch hand from the bar. "Jeb," he was kicking dirt onto her skirt. "You stole it, you little thief!" Jeb snarled. "I know you did. My coin purse was on the table." "I did not touch your money," the woman said. Her voice was shaking, but she held her hands up defensively. "I was just clearing the plates. Don't you lie to me. Mongrel!" Jeb shouted. He reached down, grabbing a handful of her hair and jerking her head back. Caleb stepped forward. His boots made no sound in the soft dust of the alley. "Let her go." The voice was not loud. It was not a shout. It was a flat, calm statement of fact. Jeb froze. He turned his head, still gripping the woman's hair. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the shadow where Caleb stood. "This is none of your business, Morgan." Jeb sneered, though his grip loosened slightly. "She is a thief. Did you see her take it?" Caleb asked. "I know her kind." Jeb spat. "They are all thieves." Caleb took 2 more steps. He stopped 5 feet away. He stood perfectly still, his arms hanging loose at his sides. His right hand was inches from the worn walnut grip of the revolver holstered at his hip. He did not posture. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who was bored with the conversation and was ready to end it. His eyes were the color of slate, cold and unreadable. "I asked if you saw her take it," Caleb said. Jeb looked at Caleb's eyes, and then at his hand. The alcohol-fueled bravado began to drain out of him. Everyone in the territory knew Caleb Morgan. They knew he didn't fight for sport. If Caleb Morgan drew his gun, he shot to kill. I didn't see it exactly," Jeb stammered. "But it is gone." "Then maybe you dropped it in the sawdust," Caleb said. "Or maybe you drank it away and forgot. Now, take your hand off her." Jeb hesitated for a fraction of a second, his pride warring with his survival instinct. Survival won. He released the woman's hair and took a step back, holding his hands up. "Fine," he muttered. "Not worth the trouble anyway. Just a saloon rat." Jeb spat on the ground near the woman's feet and pushed past Caleb, hurrying back toward the street without looking back. Caleb stood there for a moment, listening to the man's footsteps fade. Then he looked down. Elena sat in the dirt, her chest heaving. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, falling around her face in dark tangles. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide. She was waiting for it. The judgment. She waited for him to tell her she should be more careful, or that she shouldn't be working in a place like this, or to ask her if she really had stolen the money. Caleb did not say any of those things. He extended a hand. She flinched, pulling back instinctively. Caleb paused, keeping his hand steady. He waited until she realized he wasn't going to strike her. Slowly, hesitantly. She reached out. Her hand was small and rough, the skin dry. He pulled her to her feet with a strength that surprised her. She dusted off her skirt, refusing to meet his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb looked at her. He saw the red marks on her wrist where the man had grabbed her earlier. He saw the bruise forming on her arm from the fall. But mostly, he saw the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the sharp angle of her jaw. She was thin, too thin. It was the leanness of someone who ate the scraps left on plates rather than a full meal. "You are hurt," he said. "I am fine," Elena replied quickly, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "It is nothing. You should put ice on that wrist," Caleb said. "There is no ice," she said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "And I have work to do." She turned to go back into the back door of the saloon, pausing with her hand on the latch. She looked back at him. "Why did you help me?" Caleb adjusted his hat. "I do not like bullies." He turned and walked away before she could say anything else. Elena watched him go, a strange flutter in her chest. He hadn't looked at her with lust, and he hadn't looked at her with disgust. He had looked at her like she was a human being. It was a sensation so foreign she didn't know what to name it. Inside the general store, the air was cooler, smelling of pickle brine, dry leather, and roasted coffee beans. Caleb moved through the aisles, picking up a sack of flour and a tin of coffee. He placed them on the counter. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson with wire-rimmed spectacles, was talking to another rancher near the stove. "I am telling you," Henderson was saying, keeping his voice low, but not low enough. "Silas Grant is not stopping at the Valley. He bought the Higgins place last week, paid cash." The other rancher whistled. "Higgins held out for 2 years. Grant has a way of persuading people," Henderson said darkly. He has hired a lot of new hands. Hard men, gun hands, mostly. He says he wants to unify the range. Says the small operations are holding back progress. Caleb stood silently at the counter, waiting. He felt the eyes of the men slide toward him. He's eyeing the West Ridge. 2, Henderson continued, looking pointedly at Caleb. Says it is good grazing land wasted on a man who lives like a ghost. Says a man with no family has no need for 3,000 acres. Caleb placed a $5 gold piece on the counter. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Henderson jumped slightly. "Oh, Mr. Morgan, I didn't hear you come up." Caleb pushed the coin forward. That should cover the flour and the coffee. And 2 boxes of 45 cartridges. Henderson scurried to get the ammunition. He placed the boxes on the counter, his hands nervous. "We were just talking about the weather." "Caleb, I heard what you were talking about," Caleb said. He took his supplies. He didn't offer a threat. He didn't offer a defense. He simply gathered his things and walked out. But as he stepped onto the boardwalk, his jaw was set. Silas Grant. He knew the type. Men who thought the world was something to be bought and fenced. Men who thought power was the only law. Caleb had seen enough of those men in the war. He had seen them burn cities and starve populations in the name of a greater good. He felt a cold knot of tension in his gut. The peace he had carved out on his isolated ranch was fragile. And now, it seemed, the wolves were circling. By the time Caleb finished his business at the livery and packed his saddlebags, the day was dying. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple and black. The heat hadn't broken, but the wind had changed. It was picking up speed, whipping the dust into blinding clouds. The temperature was dropping fast. A storm was coming, a bad one. He mounted his horse, pulling his coat collar up. He wanted to be home before the worst of it hit. The ride back to the ranch was 2 hours, and in the dark, with a storm blowing. It could take 3. He rode out of town, the horse fighting the wind. The settlement faded behind him, the lights of the saloon and the houses winking out one by one in the gloom. He was a mile out of town when he saw the figure. Someone was walking along the side of the road, stumbling in the ruts. They were moving slowly, head bent against the gale. Caleb frowned. It was dangerous to be out here on foot at night, especially with this weather. He urged his horse forward, slowing as he drew alongside. The figure stopped and looked up. It was Elena. She was clutching a small bundle of clothes to her chest. Her hair was wild, whipped by the wind across her face. She wasn't wearing a coat, just her thin work dress and a shawl that offered no protection against the rising chill. Caleb pulled his horse to a halt. "Elena?" She looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed. She shivered violently. "Mr. Morgan, what are you doing out here?" Caleb asked, his voice raised over the sound of the wind. Elena hugged the bundle tighter. "O'Malley fired me." "Fired you? Jeb, the man you stopped. He complained to O'Malley, said I was causing trouble with the customers, said I was bad for business. O'Malley told me to get out. He said he didn't want a thief and a troublemaker in his place." She looked away, staring into the dark emptiness of the plains. "I had nowhere to go in town. I thought maybe I could walk to the next settlement." "The next settlement is 20 miles, Caleb said. "You will freeze or the coyotes will get you before you make 5. Elena looked back at him. Her face was a mask of despair, but her chin was high. "I have nowhere else." Caleb looked at the sky. A jagged streak of lightning split the clouds in the distance, followed seconds later by the low rumble of thunder. The wind howled, throwing grit against his duster. He looked at the woman standing in the dirt. She was shivering so hard her teeth were chattering. If he left her here, she would die. It was that simple. And despite everything, despite his desire for solitude, despite the danger of bringing a woman like her into his life, despite the whispers it would cause, he knew he couldn't leave her. He had walked past too many bodies in the war. He wouldn't add another to his conscience. He sat there for a long, tense pause. The horse shifted beneath him, sensing the storm. Caleb looked at the dark road ahead, then back at Elena. "Get on," he said. Elena blinked. What? Get on the horse, Caleb said, shifting his boot out of the stirrup to give her a foothold. I am not leaving you out here. Elena hesitated. She looked at his hand, then at his face. She saw the same cold, hard expression he had worn in the alley. But beneath it, she saw something else, a reluctant decency. I cannot pay you for a ride, she said softly. I did not ask for payment, Caleb said. Now climb up. The storm is breaking. She reached up. He gripped her arm, the same arm that was bruised, and swung her up behind him. She settled onto the rump of the horse, her arms coming around his waist hesitantly. She was freezing. He could feel the cold radiating off her through his heavy coat. Hold on tight, Caleb said. He spurred the horse into a canter, heading away from the town, away from the judgment and the lights, and into the dark, howling emptiness of the plains. Behind him, Elena pressed her face against his back, closing her eyes against the dust, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hope that she might survive the night. The gelding moved with a deliberate slowness, picking its way through the deepening ruts of the road. Caleb kept the pace steady, not for the sake of the beast, but for the woman clinging to the saddle behind him. The wind had turned vicious, stripping the heat from the day and replacing it with a biting chill that sought out every gap in clothing. Elena sat rigid behind the saddle cantle, her arms wrapped tentatively around Caleb's waist. She was shaking. The tremors started in her shoulders and ran down through her spine, vibrating against Caleb's back. Her dress, suitable only for the stifling heat of the saloon kitchen, was nothing more than thin cotton, offering no defense against the Wyoming night. Caleb pulled on the reins, bringing the horse to a halt. The animal huffed, mist steaming from its nostrils into the dark air. Why are we stopping? Elena asked, her voice barely audible over the gusting wind. Caleb did not answer immediately. He shifted his weight, grimacing as his bad hip popped, and swung his leg over the saddle horn to dismount. His boots hit the ground with a heavy thud. He began to unbutton his duster. It was a heavy canvas coat, lined with wool, stained with the dust of 1,000 miles and the grease of ranch work. He stripped it off, the cold hitting him instantly through his flannel shirt, but he ignored it. He walked to the side of the horse and held the coat up. Put this on, he said. Elena looked down at him from the height of the horse, in the gloom. His face was a landscape of shadows, the brim of his hat obscuring his eyes. She hesitated. To accept the coat felt like an intimacy she was not sure she could afford. It was a kindness, and in her experience, kindness always came with a tally sheet attached. I am fine, she lied, her teeth clicking together. You are turning blue, Caleb said flatly. Put it on. He did not wait for her permission. He reached up and draped the heavy garment over her shoulders. It swamped her small frame, the sleeves hanging past her hands, the hem draping over her legs. The warmth of his body was still trapped in the wool, and the scent of him, tobacco, horse sweat, and rain, enveloped her. Thank you, she whispered, pulling the collar tight around her neck. Caleb remounted, his movements stiff but efficient. He settled back into the saddle, and she wrapped her arms around him again. This time, with the barrier of the coat between them, she held on a little tighter. They rode on. The silence of the plains was not empty. It was filled with the rush of the wind and the rhythmic beat of hooves, to keep the drowsy numbness of hypothermia at bay, and perhaps to bridge the awkward chasm between them. They began to speak. It was not a fluid conversation, but a series of jagged fragments tossed back and forth against the dark. You are not from these parts, Caleb stated. It was not a question. No, Elena said. My mother was Arapaho. My father was from Mexico. We came north when I was a child. Where are they now? Dead, she said. The word was flat, polished smooth by years of saying it. My mother died crossing the desert basin. The heat took her. We ran out of water 2 days before we found the well. Caleb nodded in the dark, though she could not see it. He knew that basin. It was a graveyard that did not bother to bury its dead. And your father? He asked. He lasted a year after she passed, Elena said, "He went into the mountains to trap and never came back. The winter was hard that year. I suppose the snow took him. Or a bear. I was 12. 12, Caleb repeated. That is young to be alone. I learned to work fast," she said, her voice tightening. "I scrubbed floors in mining camps. I washed clothes until my hands bled. I did what I had to do to eat." There was a defiance in her tone, a preemptive strike against the judgment she expected. Caleb did not offer pity. He offered a trade. "I left home when I was 16. He said, "I thought the army would be an adventure." Was it? It was mud and dysentery and men screaming for their mothers. Caleb said, "I fought at Shiloh. I fought at Antietam. I learned that men are not much better than animals when the fear takes them." Elena rested her cheek against the rough wool of his coat. "You carry a gun like a man who knows how to use it. I learned that in the war," Caleb said. "And then I learned it again when I came west. The range wars were different. No uniforms, just neighbors killing neighbors over water rights and fence lines." "Is that where you got the limp?" she asked. Caleb stiffened slightly. "Yes, a skirmish near the border, a bullet through the hip. It took 6 months to close, and it reminds me every day that I am mortal." "Why do you live so far out?" she asked. "Even for a rancher. You are isolated. I have seen enough people to last me several lifetimes," Caleb said. "Crowds make my skin itch. I prefer the cows. They are honest about their needs. Grass, water, salt. People always want something more." The wind suddenly changed pitch, rising from a moan to a scream. The first drops of rain hit them like lead shot, heavy and cold. Within seconds, the heavens opened. It was not a gentle shower, but a deluge, a vertical river pouring onto the parched earth. "Hold on!" Caleb shouted over the roar of the storm. He spurred the horse into a gallop. The ground was turning slick, the dust instantly transforming into a greasy mud. Lightning flashed, illuminating the world in stark key, strobe light bursts of blue-white energy. In the flashes, Elena saw the landscape, wild, rolling hills, scrub brush thrashing in the wind, and ahead, the dark outline of buildings. They thundered through a gate, the horse sliding as Caleb pulled it up near the barn. He slid off and reached for her. Elena practically fell into his arms, her legs numb, the coat soaked through the outer layer but dry inside. He set her down on the porch of the ranch house. "Get inside," he yelled. He turned to lead the horse to the barn. Elena fumbled with the latch, her fingers stiff, until the door gave way. She stumbled into the darkness of the house, the roar of the rain muffling slightly as the door slammed shut behind her. She stood there, dripping on the floorboards, shivering violently. The house smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and dust. It was pitch black until a match flared. Caleb stood by a table, lighting a kerosene lamp. The flame caught, bathing the room in a warm, yellow glow. He had entered through the back door after stabling the horse. He was soaked, his shirt clinging to his skin, water dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked at her, then pointed to a stove in the corner. "There is wood in the box. I will get the fire going." He moved with efficient speed, stoking the embers in the iron stove and adding kindling until a fire crackled, pushing back the damp chill of the room. He gestured to a hallway. "There is a spare room down there," Caleb said. "The first door on the right. There are blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed." Elena did not move. She stood near the door, clutching the wet coat around her. The adrenaline of the ride was fading, replaced by a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She was in a strange man's house, miles from civilization, with no one to hear her scream. She knew how the story usually went. She had lived it enough times. She took a breath, steeling herself. "Which room is yours?" she asked. Caleb looked at her, pausing in the act of hanging his wet hat on a peg. "The one at the end of the hall." "And what happens now?" Elena asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were dark with wariness. Caleb frowned. "You get out of those wet clothes. You sleep." Elena took a step back, her back pressing against the rough wood of the door. "And then, what is the price?" "Mister, Morgan, men do not ride into storms to save women like me for free. Do you want me to come to your room tonight? Is that the arrangement? Caleb stood perfectly still. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the deep lines around his eyes and the scar that ran through his stubble. He looked at her not with anger, but with a profound weariness. He saw the terror she was trying to mask with cynicism. He saw a woman who had been trained by the world to view herself as currency. He walked over to a chair and sat down heavily, beginning to pull off his mud-caked boots. My brother, Samuel, used to sleep in that room, Caleb said quietly. He died 4 years ago. A dispute over a property line. He was 19. I have not had the heart to clear it out. But the bed is good. He pulled the boot off and set it aside, then looked her squarely in the eyes. I do not want you in my bed. Elena, I do not want your body. I brought you here because the alternative was leaving you to die in the ditch, and I have enough ghosts following me already. Elena stared at him, searching his face for the lie. She could not find one. Then what do you want? She demanded. Work, Caleb said. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his bad hip. The house is a wreck. I am no good at keeping it. Harlan is too old to scrub floors. Cook if you can. Help where you are able. Eat at my table. Sleep in a warm bed. That is all. His voice was devoid of negotiation. It was a simple statement of facts. Elena felt the tension in her chest coil tight and then, slowly, begin to unravel. It was more unsettling than a demand would have been. A demand she could fight or endure. Generosity, true, no strings attached decency, was a landscape she did not know how to navigate. She nodded slowly. I can cook, and I can clean. Good, Caleb said. He stood up and walked to the kitchen cupboard, pulling out a loaf of bread and a piece of dried beef. Eat something, then go to sleep. We rise early here. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The storm had blown itself out by morning, leaving the world scoured clean and shining under the brutal return of the sun. Elena approached her new life with the ferocity of a soldier fortifying a position. She started with the kitchen. It was a disaster of grease, soot, and accumulated grime. She found buckets and rags, heating water on the stove until the room sweltering. She scrubbed the floorboards until the wood turned 3 shades lighter. She scoured the pots until she could see her own reflection in the iron. Caleb and Harlan were gone from before dawn until after dusk, working the cattle on the far range. This left Elena alone with the house and the silence. It was the silence that stunned her most. In town, there was always noise, the piano in the saloon, the shouting of drunks, the rattle of wagons, the barking of dogs. Here, the silence was a physical weight. It pressed against the windows. But as she worked, she began to realize it was not empty. It was filled with the wind sighing through the eaves, the cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high above, the settling creaks of the timber house. For the first time in years, the noise in her head began to quiet. The constant vigilance, the need to listen for heavy footsteps approaching her door, began to recede, if only slightly. She found Caleb's shirts in a pile in the corner of his room. She had entered hesitantly, feeling like an intruder, just to retrieve the laundry. They were missing buttons, torn at the elbows, frayed at the collars. She sat on the porch in the afternoon light, needle and thread in hand, mending them with small, precise stitches. When Caleb returned in the evenings, the house smelled of soap and stew. He would stop at the door, scraping the mud from his boots, and look around as if he had walked into the wrong house. He said little. He would sit at the table, eating the beans and cornbread she prepared, nodding his thanks. But he watched her. He noticed things. He noticed that she never sat with her back to the door. She always positioned her chair so she had a clear line of sight to the exit and to him. He noticed that when he walked into a room unexpectedly, her entire body went rigid, her hand twitching toward a pocket where he suspected she carried a small knife. One morning, he passed the open door of her room. She was asleep, the morning light falling across the quilt. One of her feet was sticking out from under the blanket. She was wearing her boots. Caleb paused, a shadow crossing his face. He knew that habit. He had done the same thing for a year after the war. It was the habit of someone who expected to have to run for their life at a moment's notice. He moved on down the hall, his footsteps silent. He would not ask her about it. He would not tell her she was safe, because words were cheap. He would simply let the days pile up, one after another, peaceful and dull, until her body learned what her mind refused to believe. The reprieve of the storm was short-lived. The moisture evaporated within days, and the heat returned with a vengeance. A drought began to settle over the territory like a heavy wool blanket. The sky turned a bleached, blinding white. The grass, briefly green from the rain, yellowed and turned brittle. The creek, which had been flowing, began to retreat. It broke into a series of stagnant pools, then into muddy depressions. The cattle grew restless. They clustered in the meager shade of the cottonwoods, their ribs beginning to show through their hides. Caleb and Harlan worked themselves to the bone. One evening, Caleb came in, his face gray with dust. "The deep well," he said, dropping his hat on the table. "We have to start hauling from the deep well to the troughs. The creek is finished." It was back-breaking work. The windmill at the deep well pumped water, but it had to be carted in barrels to the pastures where the herd was grazing. "I can help," Elena said. Caleb looked at her hands. They were already rougher than they had been a week ago, but they were still small. "This is heavy work. Elena, I am not an invalid." "Caleb," she said, her eyes flashing, "I eat your food. I sleep under your roof. I will earn it." Caleb held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "All right. You can drive the wagon. Harlan and I will load the barrels." For the next week, Elena lived in the dust and the sun. She drove the buckboard wagon back and forth across the baking earth. The rains blistered her palms. The sun beat down on her bonnet, making her head swim. But she did not complain. She hauled water until her shoulders felt like they were on fire. She watched Caleb work. He was relentless. He ignored his limp, ignored the heat. He moved with a grim determination, lifting barrels that would have broken a lesser man. He treated the cattle with a rough tenderness, speaking to them in low tones. One afternoon, as she poured a bucket of water into a trough, she saw Harlan watching her. The old man leaned on his shovel, wiping sweat from his brow. "You work hard for a girl from town." Harlan grunted. "I am not a girl from town," Elena said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am a woman who pays her debts." Harlan spat tobacco juice onto a dry patch of ground. "Caleb is a good man. He has had a hard run of it, but he is a good man." "I know," Elena said softly. "Does the town know?" Harlan asked, eyeing her. "Or do they just know what they want to see?" "They see what they want," Elena said. "They always do." The heat broke only to be replaced by wind. It was a dry, scouring wind that picked up the loose topsoil and turned the air into a brown haze. The sun became a dim orange disk behind the curtain of dust. Night fell, but the wind did not die down. It howled around the ranch house, battering the walls. The windows rattled in their frames, a constant, erratic clattering that sounded like knuckles rapping on glass. Inside, the air was stifling. Caleb sat in his leather chair, reading a tattered book by the light of the lamp. Elena was in the kitchen, drying the last of the dishes. The wind gusted, hitting the side of the house with a force that made the timbers groan. A handful of gravel and sand was flung against the kitchen window. Crack, rattle, thud. Elena froze. The plate in her hand slipped, shattering on the floor. She didn't hear the ceramic break. All she heard was the banging. "Open up! Open the door!" The memory washed over her, vivid and terrifying. It was 3 years ago, a mining camp, a flimsy door with no lock, men shouting, drunk and angry, pounding on the wood splintering, the hands grabbing her. The window rattled again, violent and demanding. Elena gasped, backing away. She hit the counter, sliding down until she was curled in the corner, her arms wrapped over her head. She couldn't breathe. The room was closing in. The sound of the wind was the sound of their voices. "No," she whispered. No, please, go away. Caleb looked up at the sound of the breaking plate. He stood up, putting his book down. Elena? He walked into the kitchen. He saw the shards of pottery on the floor. Then he saw her. She was pressed into the corner between the stove and the wall, rocking slightly, her hands clutching her hair. She was hyperventilating. Short, sharp gasps that sounded like a wounded animal. Caleb stopped in the doorway. He assessed the situation instantly. He didn't see a clumsy woman who had dropped a plate. He saw a soldier in the grip of a shell-shocked nightmare. He had seen it 100 times in the tents after a battle. He did not rush to her. He did not try to touch her. He knew that to a trapped mind. Any touch was an attack. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to the floor, sitting cross-legged near the doorway, 10 feet away from her. He kept his hands visible, resting on his knees. Elena, he said. His voice was low, resonant, and calm. It is just the wind. Elena did not look up. She was shaking violently. They are here, she choked out. They are at the door. No one is at the door. Caleb said, the gate is locked. Harlan is in the bunkhouse. It is just you and me. And the wind. He waited a beat. The window rattled again. Elena whimpered, shrinking further into herself. I hate the wind too, Caleb said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the price of feed. When I was in Virginia, we were pinned down in a trench for 3 days. The cannon fire never stopped. It shook the ground so hard my teeth ached. Elena's rocking slowed slightly. She didn't look up, but she was listening. The dirt, Caleb continued, keeping his voice steady. That was the worst part. The explosions kicked up so much dirt you could taste it. It tasted like copper and sulfur. I thought I would never get that taste out of my mouth. I thought the noise would never stop. He took a slow breath. But it did stop. The guns went quiet. The smoke cleared. And I was still there. He looked at her curled form. You are still here, Elena. The door is holding. The walls are thick. Nothing is getting in here tonight. Elena slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of terror. Her face streaked with tears. She looked at Caleb. He was sitting on the floor, a ridiculous place for a man of his dignity, looking calm and solid as a mountain. He wasn't looking at her with pity or confusion. He was looking at her with recognition. He knew what it was like to be trapped in a memory. Is it really just the wind? She whispered. Caleb nodded. Just the wind. It is throwing sand at the glass. It sounds like knuckles, doesn't it? Yes, she breathed. It is a liar, Caleb said. The wind lies. It tries to tell you things that aren't true. Elena let out a long, shuddering breath. Her hands uncurled from her hair. She looked at her trembling fingers. I am sorry about the plate. The plate is nothing, Caleb said. We have others. He did not move to help her up. He stayed where he was, giving her the space to reassemble herself. He watched her breathing slow, watched the color return to her cheeks. When she finally moved, uncurling her legs and wiping her face with her apron, Caleb stood up slowly. Leave the pieces, he said gently. We can sweep them up in the morning. He turned and walked back into the main room, picking up his book. He sat down and began to read, or pretended to. He was signaling that the crisis was over, that she hadn't ruined anything, that she hadn't scared him away. Elena remained in the kitchen for a moment, listening. The window rattled again. She flinched, but this time, she looked at the glass. Just the wind, she thought, just a liar. She looked into the other room, at the back of Caleb's head. For the first time since she could remember, the knot of fear in her chest loosened not because she was hiding, but because she wasn't alone. A fragile thread, thin as a spider web but strong as steel, stretched between them. It was trust, and for tonight, it was enough to hold the darkness at bay. The weeks that followed the storm brought a strange, suspended peace to the ranch. Brittle as dried grass, but peace nonetheless. Elena Marquez was no longer the trembling creature who had huddled in the corner while the wind screamed lies at the window. The ranch demanded strength, and she found it buried deep within herself, under layers of shame and fear that were slowly beginning to peel away in the dry Wyoming air. Her hands, once raw with blisters, grew calloused and capable. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental wood stove, judging the heat by the feeling on her cheek rather than a gauge. She learned to scrub the heavy canvas work shirts until the water ran clear, and she learned to listen to the land. She could tell the difference between the coyote's yip that meant a kill and the one that meant loneliness. She found a rhythm in the chores, a satisfying exhaustion that allowed her to sleep without dreaming of the men who had used her. But the ranch was an island, and the ocean around it was filled with sharks. Red Creek was small, and boredom was a disease that the townsfolk treated with gossip. The story of Caleb Morgan picking up the saloon girl on the road had not just reached town. It had galloped there, growing monstrous with every retelling. By the time it reached the church steps and the back room of the general store, it was no longer an act of charity. It was a scandal. It was proof that the solitary rancher was not just a recluse, but a man of low morals, harboring a woman of unnatural appetites and tainted blood. The reckoning arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, riding in a polished black buggy that looked obscenely clean against the dust of the yard. Caleb was in the corral, working a colt that had been spooked by a rattlesnake. He held the lead rope with easy confidence, murmuring low to the animal, when the sound of wheels on gravel made him turn. Elena was on the porch, shaking out a rug. She froze, clutching the fabric to her chest as the buggy halted. Two men stepped down. One was Reverend Thorne, a tall, gaunt man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that saw sin in the flight of a bird. The other was Silas Grant. Silas was a man who took up space. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit of fine gray wool that must have been sweltering in the heat, with a gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. He had the face of a man who was used to eating the best cuts of meat while others gnawed on bones. Caleb tied the colt to the rail and walked toward the gate. He did not remove his hat. He did not smile. He wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving streaks of dust. "Gentlemen," Caleb said. His voice was flat. "Mr. Morgan," Silas said. His voice was rich, like oil pouring over gravel. "We missed you at the town meeting last night. I had fences to mend." Caleb replied. Reverend Thorne stepped forward, clutching a Bible to his chest as if it were a shield. Fences of wood and wire are one thing, Caleb. But the fences of the soul required tending too. Caleb looked at the preacher, then passed him to Elena. She had not moved. She stood like a statue on the porch, her face pale. Thorne followed his gaze, his lip curling slightly in distaste. "We are here on a matter of some delicacy," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "There is talk, Caleb, ugly talk, about the arrangement you have here." Caleb crossed his arms. "Is that so? The community is concerned," Thorne continued. "Emboldened by his own righteousness, it is not proper for a man living alone to house a woman of her history. It invites moral decay. It sets a poor example for the families of this valley. She works here," Caleb said. "She earns her keep." Silas chuckled softly. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Come now, Morgan. We are men of the world. We know what kind of work a woman like that is suited for, and we know it is not scrub brushes." Caleb's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the yard seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Be careful. Silas, you are standing on my land. I am standing on land that is being wasted," Silas countered, his smile vanishing. "But that is a separate issue, or perhaps not. You see, Caleb, a man's reputation is his credit, and right now, your credit is failing. The bank in the city hears things. They hear that Caleb Morgan has lost his judgment, that he is harboring whores and fighting in alleys." Elena flinched as if he had thrown a stone at her. Silas stepped closer to the fence, lowering his voice. "Look, I am a reasonable man. I want this valley to prosper. I want you to prosper. If you were to send the girl away, perhaps back to where she belongs, or even just out of the territory, it would show the town that you have come to your senses. It might make me reconsider the offer I made on those grazing rights. It might make the bank reconsider calling in that note on your equipment." Caleb stood very still. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat. He looked at the preacher, who was nodding in agreement. and then at Silas, who watched him with the predatory patience of a wolf. Then he looked at Elena. She was staring at her boots, shame radiating off her in waves. "Get in your buggy," Caleb said softly. Silas blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Get off my land," Caleb repeated. Louder this time. "Both of you," Thorne gasped. "Caleb, you cannot dismiss the counsel of the church so lightly. She is a temptation, a Jezebel who is—" "She is a human being," Caleb cut in, his voice cracking like a whip, "and she stays as long as she chooses to stay. If you want to worry about souls, Reverend, worry about your own, and you, Silas, if you want my land, you will have to take it. I am not trading a woman's life for your favor." Silas stared at him for a long moment. The mask of civility slipped, revealing the cold iron beneath. Lonely men make foolish choices. "Morgan," Silas said quietly, "and they pay dearly for them. You are holding a losing hand. Don't blame me when the table gets overturned." Silas turned and climbed back into the buggy. Thorne followed, casting one last glare of condemnation at the porch. Silas snapped the reins, and the buggy lurched forward, wheeling around and heading back down the long drive, leaving a cloud of dust that tasted of bitterness. That night, the silence in the ranch house was heavy. Caleb sat in his leather chair, staring at an unread book. Elena was in the kitchen, pretending to organize the pantry, but her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped a jar of preserves. She needed air. She slipped out the back door, intending to walk to the barn to check on the horses, a task that usually soothed her. As she approached the corral, she heard voices. It was Harlan and Caleb. They were leaning against the fence in the shadows, the glowing ember of Harlan's pipe bobbing in the dark. She stopped. She knew she should announce herself, but the tone of Harlan's voice froze her feet. "Telling you—" "Caleb, it is not just talk," Harlan was saying. His voice was gruff, filled with a worry he rarely showed. "Silas has the sheriff in his pocket. He has the judge in the next county. And now he has the church. Let him have them," Caleb replied. His voice sounded tired. "You are fighting a war on all fronts," Harlan said. "And for what? A cook? I like the girl. Caleb. She works hard. But she is a lightning rod. Siding with a woman like her, with her past, it puts a target on your back. A target you do not need." There was a silence. Elena held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited for Caleb to agree. She waited for him to say that Harlan was right, that it was too much trouble, that she wasn't worth the risk. The target was already there. "Harlan," Caleb said finally. "It was there the day I refused to sell the South pasture. It was there when I told Silas I would not join his cattlemen's association. Elena is just the excuse he is using to pull the trigger. She makes it easy for him." Harlan grunted. "Maybe," Caleb said. "But I am not turning her out. I walked past enough people in need during the war. I told myself I was following orders. I told myself I couldn't save everyone. I am done telling myself that." "She stays." Elena backed away slowly, her boots silent in the dirt. She retreated to the house, her chest aching with a hollow, crushing guilt. He was defending her. He was risking everything, his land, his reputation, his safety, for her. And Harlan was right. She was a lightning rod. As long as she was here, Silas had a weapon to use against him. She was the weakness in his armor. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed. She looked around at the simple, clean space, the quilt on the bed, the wash basin in the corner. It was the first home she had known in 10 years. And because she loved it, and because she was starting to care for the man who gave it to her, she knew she had to leave. Dawn came with a bleeding sky. The horizon was streaked with pale pink and bruised purple, the light touching the tips of the sagebrush with gold. The air was cold and still. Elena moved like a ghost. She had packed her small bundle, the few clothes she owned, a comb, a piece of bread. She left the coat Caleb had given her folded neatly on the chair. She would not take it. She would not take anything that belonged to him. She slipped out the front door, closing it softly. The hinges held their breath. She walked down the long dirt driveway, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. She did not look back. If she looked back, she would break. She focused on the road ahead, on the long walk to the main road, on the uncertain future that awaited her. She would go to the city, or maybe west, to California, anywhere that wasn't here. She reached the main gate, a mile from the house. Her hand was on the latch when she heard the horse. She froze. Caleb was there. He was sitting on his gelding, still as a statue, waiting in the shadow of a cottonwood tree. He was wearing his duster, his hat pulled low. He looked like part of the landscape, as rugged and immovable as the hills. "Going somewhere?" he asked. His voice was rough with sleep and morning air. Elena gripped her bundle. She didn't turn to face him. "I am leaving. Caleb, I see that," he said. He nudged the horse forward, blocking the gate. "Why? You know why?" she said, her voice trembling. "I heard you talking to Harlan. I heard what Silas said. I am ruining you." Caleb dismounted. He walked toward her. His limp pronounced in the cold morning, "You are not ruining anything that wasn't already broken." "Elena, I am a target," she cried, spinning around to face him. Tears were streaming down her face, hot and fast. Harlan was right. "I am a weight around your neck. Silas will use me to destroy you. If I leave, he loses his leverage." "And where will you go?" Caleb asked quietly. "Away," she said. "Anywhere." "To do what?" Caleb took another step. "The world hasn't changed since I picked you up on that road. Elena, it is still hungry. It still wants to eat you alive. I can handle it," she sobbed. "I have handled it before." "Have you?" Caleb asked. "Or have you just survived it?" Elena dropped her bundle in the dirt. She stared at him, her chest heaving. "You do not understand. You think you are saving me, but you do not know what you are saving. You do not know what I am. I know who you are," Caleb said. "No, you don't!" Her voice rose to a scream, shattering the morning quiet. "You see a victim. You see a girl who had some bad luck. But that is not it. I sold myself, Caleb. Not just once, not just when I was starving. I did it for a warm room. I did it for a bottle of whiskey to make the night go faster. I let men touch me, men who smelled like rot and death, because it was easier than fighting them." She was shaking violently, the confession pouring out of her like poison. "They called me every name there is," she choked out. "Whore, savage, mongrel," and I answered to them. I smiled for them. I let them put their hands on me, and I pretended I didn't hate them because I wanted to live. That is what is in my house. Caleb, that is what is eating your food. Not a lady, not a project, just used goods, just dirt. She stopped, gasping for air, waiting for the look of disgust, the look that said I didn't know it was that bad. She waited for him to step back. Caleb did not step back. He stepped forward. He reached out and took her by the shoulders. His grip was hard, not hurting, but anchoring. He forced her to look at him. His eyes were not filled with disgust. They were filled with a fury so intense it looked like fire. But the fire wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the empty road, at the town, at the world that had done this to her. "You think that makes you dirt?" Caleb asked, his voice a low growl. "You think surviving makes you unworthy?" Elena stared at him, stunned by the intensity in his face. "I fought in a war where men blew each other apart for a patch of mud," Caleb said. "I saw generals send boys into cannon fire just to test the range. I have done things. I have killed men. Elena, I have looked a man in the eye and ended his life because he was wearing a different color coat. Do you think I am clean? Do you think I am pure?" He shook her gently. "We are all dirt, Elena. We are all just trying to stay above the ground for one more day. What you did to survive, that is not your shame. That is their crime." He let go of her shoulders and brushed a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. "Don't make me watch you walk back into hell," he whispered. "Please, I cannot watch that." Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth. He wasn't judging her. He was seeing her pain and matching it with his own. The wall she had built, the wall of shame, crumbled. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against the cold morning wind. They stood there for a long time as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the world in gold, two broken things holding each other together. "Come home," Caleb said softly. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The truce with the world could not last. 3 days later, the reality of running a ranch forced their hand. They were out of coffee, out of flour, and out of fencing staples. A trip to town was unavoidable. "I will go alone," Caleb had suggested. No, Elena had said, her jaw set. "If I hide, they win. If I hide, I am admitting I have something to be ashamed of." So they rode into Red Creek together. The wagon rattled over the dry ruts of Main Street. The town felt different this time. The silence was sharper. Heads turned as they passed. Whispers trailed behind them like dust. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the general store. "Stay close to me," he murmured. They walked up the boardwalk steps. A group of men was lounging in front of the saloon next door. It wasn't Jeb this time. It was a group of younger men, ranch hands from Silas Grant's new crew. They wore clean hats and shiny spurs, the uniforms of hired muscle. One of them, a blond youth with a cruel mouth, leaned against the post, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. "Well, look at that," the boy said, loud enough to stop traffic. "The hermit came out of his hole, and he brought his pet." Caleb didn't break stride. He reached for the door of the store. "I didn't know you paid for company." "Morgan," another man called out. "I thought you were too cheap, though I guess you get a discount on damaged goods." Elena stiffened, her face burning. Caleb stopped. He took a slow breath and turned around. The young men straightened up, grinning. They were looking for a fight. They had been paid to look for a fight. "You got something to say?" Caleb asked quietly. "I am just saying," the blond youth drawled, stepping forward. "It must be hard to sleep knowing half the town has been there before you." The insult hung in the air, heavy and foul. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't warn. The violence that he had kept buried for 15 years, the soldier's reflex, surged to the surface. He moved with a speed that belied his age and his limp. One moment he was standing still. The next, he was inside the youth's guard. His right fist connected with the boy's nose with a sickening crunch of cartilage. The boy's head snapped back, blood spraying onto the boardwalk. He crumpled without a sound. The other two men roared and charged. Caleb ducked a swinging haymaker, driving his elbow into the attacker's ribs. The man gasped, collapsing to his knees. The third man managed to grapple Caleb, shoving him back against the wall of the store. Elena screamed. "Caleb!" Caleb grunted, twisting his body. He used the man's momentum against him, throwing him into a stack of barrels. The man crashed down, dazed. Caleb stood in the center of the boardwalk, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. The blond youth was groaning on the ground, clutching his ruined face. Caleb adjusted his coat. He looked down at them with cold, dead eyes. "Keep her name out of your mouths," he rasped. "That is enough." The voice boomed from the street. Sheriff Brady was marching toward them, a double-barreled shotgun in the crook of his arm. Brady was a thick man with a face like a bulldog and a conscience that had been bought by Silas Grant 2 years ago. He looked at the unconscious boy, then at Caleb. "Assault," Brady said, spitting on the ground. "Disturbing the peace." "They started it," Elena cried, stepping forward. "They insulted us." "They attacked him. I saw what I saw." "Missy," Brady said, ignoring her. He pointed the shotgun at Caleb. "You are under arrest. Morgan." Caleb looked at the sheriff, then at the gun. He looked at Elena. She was pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Go to the wagon," Caleb told her. "Go back to the ranch." "I am not leaving you. Go," Caleb commanded. "Harlan is there. Tell him what happened. Do not stay in town." Caleb slowly raised his hands. Brady stepped forward, taking Caleb's gun from his holster. 2 deputies appeared, grabbing Caleb's arms and marching him toward the jailhouse. Elena stood on the boardwalk, shaking, watching as they dragged him away. She was alone in a town that hated her, with the man who protected her locked behind bars. The stares of the townsfolk felt like physical blows. She grit her teeth, climbed into the wagon, and whipped the horses into a frenzy, tearing out of town not in flight, but to get help. The jail cell was small, smelling of urine and old straw. A single barred window high on the wall let in a square of gray evening light. Caleb sat on the narrow cot, nursing his bruised knuckles. The heavy iron door clanged open. Sheriff Brady walked in, followed by Silas Grant. Silas looked impeccable, untouched by the dust and violence of the day. "Leave us," Silas said. Brady nodded and retreated, closing the door. Silas pulled a wooden chair from the corner and sat down outside the bars. He took a cigar from his pocket, clipped the end, and lit it. The smoke drifted into the cell, sweet and expensive. "You have a heavy hand." "Caleb," Silas said, "that boy's nose is shattered. He might never breathe right again." "He should have learned manners," Caleb said, leaning back against the cold stone wall. "Perhaps, but now you are looking at assault charges, maybe attempted murder if the judge feels uncharitable. And Judge Holloway, well, he and I have dinner every Sunday." Caleb said nothing. He watched the smoke curl in the air. "I am a businessman," Silas said, inspecting the ash of his cigar. "I do not like waste. You sitting in a territorial prison for 5 years is a waste. The girl starving on the street is a waste. What do you want, Silas?" "The same thing I have always wanted. The deed to your ranch." Silas stood up and walked to the bars, his voice dropping to a persuasive murmur. "Here is the bargain. Caleb, you sign the deed over to me. I will pay you a fair market price, minus a fee for the trouble you have caused. Of course, you take that money, you take the girl, and you leave. Go to California, go to Oregon, start over where no one knows her name." "And the charges?" Caleb asked. "They disappear. The boy decides not to press charges. The sheriff loses the paperwork. You walk out of here tonight." Caleb looked at Silas. He saw the confidence in the man's eyes. Silas thought he had won. He thought he had found the pressure point. "And if I refuse?" Silas sighed. "Then you go to trial. You go to prison. And the girl, well, without you, she won't last a week on that ranch alone. The bank will foreclose. She will be back on the street, or worse. The wolves will come for her. Caleb, you know they will." Caleb stood up. He walked to the bars, standing toe-to-toe with Silas. "You are right," Caleb said. "The wolves will come, but I am not selling my land to the head wolf just to save myself the trouble of shooting him." Silas's face hardened. "You are a fool. You are choosing pride over her life." "No," Caleb said. "I am choosing not to let a man like you decide my life. I am not selling. Silas, not today. Not ever." Silas stared at him for a long, cold minute. Then he dropped the cigar on the floor and crushed it under his polished boot heel. "Have it your way," Silas said softly. "But remember this, Morgan, everyone pays in the end, one way or another. You think you can fight the future? I am the future." He turned and walked out. The heavy door slammed shut, locking Caleb in the gathering dark. Caleb sat back down on the cot. He listened to the silence of the jail. He thought of Elena driving the wagon back alone. He thought of the storm that was coming, not of rain this time, but of men and greed and fire. He closed his eyes. He didn't know how he was going to get out of this, but he knew one thing: he wasn't running anymore. The morning light was gray and unforgiving, filtering through the grime of the jailhouse window to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the stale air. Caleb sat on the edge of the cot, his head hanging low. His knuckles were swollen and purple. The skin split where he had connected with the ranch hand's face, but that was a distant ache compared to the fire burning in his hip. The damp chill of the cell floor had seeped into his bones during the night, waking the old injury from its dormant state into a furious, throbbing presence. The heavy iron door groaned on its hinges. Harlan stood there, his weathered face looking older than Caleb had ever seen it. The old cowhand held his hat in his hands, his knuckles white, behind him. Sheriff Brady sat at his desk, counting a stack of coins with deliberate, mocking slowness. "That is the bail," Brady said, not looking up, "though I reckon it is money thrown down a well." Harlan ignored the lawman. He stepped into the cell area, his eyes finding Caleb. "Let us go. Caleb, the horses are outside." Caleb stood up. The room tilted dangerously, black spots swimming in his vision. He grit his teeth, forcing the world to right itself, and limped out of the cell. He did not look at the sheriff. He did not ask about the charges. He just walked, one painful step at a time, until he hit the boardwalk. The town of Red Creek was awake, and it was watching. As Caleb and Harlan moved toward the hitching rail, the activity on the street seemed to suspend. Men paused in their loading of wagons. Women crossing the street stopped and turned their heads. It was not the fearful respect Caleb was used to. It was something sharper, colder. He lost his mind. A voice drifted from the porch of the general store. A whisper meant to be heard. "Threw his life away for a whore." Harlan stiffened, his hand drifting toward the knife at his belt. But Caleb grabbed his arm. His grip was weak, trembling. "Leave it," Caleb rasped. "Just ride." They mounted up. The effort of swinging his leg over the saddle nearly made Caleb black out. A sharp, tearing pain ripped through his hip, stealing the breath from his lungs. He slumped forward for a second, clutching the saddle horn, sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the morning chill. "You all right?" Harlan asked, his voice low. "Ride," Caleb commanded. They rode out of town under the weight of 100 stares. The sky to the west was bruising, deep purples and blacks swallowing the blue. The air was heavy, charged with the static of an approaching storm. It was the kind of weather that made animals pace and men edginess. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Harlan kept glancing over, his concern growing as he saw Caleb's posture deteriorate. The rancher was listing to the left, his face pale as ash, his breathing shallow and rapid. The wind began to pick up, whipping the sagebrush back and forth. The temperature plummeted. Thunder rumbled, a low, tectonic growl that vibrated through the ground. "Caleb?" Harlan called out over the rising wind. Caleb did not answer. He pulled his horse up sharply, the animal dancing nervously. Caleb leaned over the neck of the horse and coughed, a wet, hacking sound that seemed to tear at his insides. When he pulled his hand away from his mouth, his glove was speckled with bright, red blood. Harlan was beside him in an instant, grabbing Caleb's reins. "You are bleeding inside," Harlan shouted. "The fight!" "It is the fever," Caleb gasped, wiping his mouth. "The hip, it has gone bad." He tried to straighten up, but a spasm of agony doubled him over again. The damp cell, the physical exertion of the fight, and the stress had conspired to turn the old scar tissue into a septic trap. The infection he had fought off for years had returned with a vengeance. "We need to get you to a doctor," Harlan said, looking back toward town. "No," Caleb wheezed. "No town. They will not help. Ride for the ranch." "We won't make the ranch," Harlan yelled as the first fat drops of rain hit the dust like bullets. "Look at that sky." A wall of water was racing across the plains toward them, a gray curtain obliterating the horizon. Lightning forked down, hitting the ground less than a mile away with a crack that made the horses scream. "The line cabin," Caleb managed to say, pointing a trembling hand toward the foothills. "The North Ridge. It is closer." They turned their horses, spurring them into a run as the heavens opened. It was not rain. It was a deluge. The water fell in sheets, instantly turning the dry earth into a slick, treacherous slurry of mud. Hail the size of marbles began to mix with the rain, stinging their faces and hands. They rode blindly, heads down against the onslaught. Caleb was barely conscious, holding onto the saddle horn by instinct alone. Every jolt of the horse sent a spike of white-hot agony through his body. He was burning up, his skin on fire while the ice-cold rain soaked him to the bone. They reached the line cabin just as the storm intensified into a full gale. It was a crude structure, little more than a shack of rough-hewn logs built for shelter during winter roundups. Harlan jumped down and kicked the door open. He grabbed Caleb, hauling him out of the saddle. Caleb's legs gave way the moment they touched the ground. Harlan caught him, dragging him through the mud and into the darkness of the cabin. Elena was there, She had arrived only an hour before, having driven the wagon like a madwoman to get help, only to be forced to shelter when the sky turned black. She had found Harlan there, waiting out the weather, and they had both been preparing to ride back to town when Caleb arrived. "Caleb!" Elena screamed, rushing forward. "Help me get him to the bunk!" Harlan grunted, struggling under Caleb's dead weight. Together, they hoisted him onto the narrow wooden platform that served as a bed. The cabin was freezing, the air smelling of wet wool and rat droppings. Harlan struck a match, lighting a kerosene lantern that hung from a rusty nail. The yellow light revealed the ruin of Caleb Morgan. His eyes were glazed, rolling back in his head. His breath rattled in his chest. His clothes were soaked, muddy water pooling on the floor beneath him. "Get his coat off," Elena ordered, her hands flying to the buttons. They stripped the heavy duster and his flannel shirt away. When they exposed his left hip, Elena gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, the old bullet wound, usually a pale, jagged pucker of skin, was a swollen, angry mass of red and purple. The tissue around it was hard and hot to the touch, radiating heat like a stove. Red streaks were shooting up toward his ribs. "It is poisoned," Harlan said quietly. "The blood is poisoned." Caleb groaned, thrashing his head from side to side. "My knife, in the saddlebag. You cannot use a knife." "Caleb," Elena said, her voice shaking. "You're shaking too bad. Got to—" "Cut it," Caleb mumbled, his teeth chattering. "Drain it, or the fever takes the heart." He tried to sit up, his hand clawing for his belt, but his arm collapsed. He fell back, a cry of pain tearing from his throat. Harlan looked at Elena. "He is right, girl. If that pus doesn't come out, he is a dead man before morning. The infection is moving fast." "I cannot do it," Elena whispered, backing away. "I cannot cut him." "You have to," Harlan said grimly. "My hands are crippled with arthritis. I cannot hold a blade steady enough for this. It has to be you." Elena looked at Caleb. He was watching her, his slate-gray eyes lucid for a terrifying second. "Elena," he rasped. "Please." The storm slammed against the cabin walls, the wind howling like a banshee. The roof leaked in the corner. A steady drip, drip, drip that sounded like a clock counting down. Elena took a breath. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "Get the knife. Harlan! And the whiskey." Harlan moved quickly. He retrieved Caleb's hunting knife, a long, sharp blade of carbon steel, and a flask of whiskey from the saddlebags. He poured the liquor over the blade, then handed the flask to Caleb. "Drink," Harlan said. "All of it." Caleb drank, coughing as the burning liquid hit his throat. He drained the flask and let it drop to the floor. Elena took the knife. Her hand was trembling violently. She looked at the angry, swollen flesh. She knew what she had to do. She had to slice deep through the scar tissue to find the pocket of infection. She had to hurt the only man who had ever shown her kindness. She couldn't do it. If she heard him scream, if she saw his face twist in agony caused by her hand, she would drop the knife. She would break. She looked around the room frantically. Her eyes landed on a piece of leather strapping hanging from a peg, part of an old bridle. "Give me that," she pointed. Harlan grabbed the strap and handed it to her. Elena cut a 6-inch section of the thick, stiff leather. She walked to the bunk and knelt beside Caleb. "Caleb," she said, her voice trembling. He looked at her. "Do it, Elena, I am going to," she said. Tears were spilling from her eyes now, hot tracks on her cold cheeks. "But I need you to help me." "Anything," he whispered. She held up the piece of leather. "Put it in my mouth," she begged. "Please." Caleb stared at her, confusion clouding his fevered gaze. "What?" "Put the strap in my mouth," Elena cried softly. "I need to bite down. If I scream, if I lose my nerve, I cannot stop. Caleb, I cannot stop once I start. Please, give me something to hold on to." Caleb understood. She wasn't asking for protection for herself. She was asking for a way to endure the pain of hurting him. She needed to anchor her own terror so she could save him. Slowly, with a shaking hand, Caleb reached up. He took the leather strap from her. His fingers brushed her lips, gentle, calloused, burning with fever. "Open." he whispered. Elena opened her mouth. Caleb placed the thick leather between her teeth. She bit down on it, hard, the taste of salt and old tanning oil filling her mouth. She nodded at him, her jaw clenched tight, her eyes wide and terrified. Harlan moved to the head of the bunk. "I will hold his shoulders," he said. Elena looked at the wound. She took a breath through her nose. She tightened her grip on the knife handle until her knuckles were white. She bit down on the leather until her jaw ached. And she cut. Caleb's body bowed off the bunk, a guttural, animal sound tearing from his throat. Harlan threw his weight onto Caleb's chest, pinning him down. Elena did not look at Caleb's face. She couldn't. She focused entirely on the knife, on the resistance of the tough scar tissue, on the sudden release as the blade found the pocket. She bit into the leather so hard she felt her teeth shift. A scream was trapped in her throat, vibrating in her chest, but the strap held it in. She let the tears fall, blinding her, splashing onto Caleb's bare, burning skin. "Deeper," Harlan ordered. "You have to get it all." Elena sobbed through her nose, a high, keen sound, and pressed the knife deeper. Blood and corruption welled up, draining from the wound. Caleb stopped struggling. He went limp, his head lolling to the side, unconscious from the pain. "It is done," Harlan said, his voice gentle. "It is done. Girl." Elena dropped the knife. It clattered to the floor. She spat the leather strap out. It fell onto the blanket, marked with the deep indentations of her teeth. She collapsed forward, her forehead resting on Caleb's shoulder. Right next to the bandages, Harlan was now pressing against the wound. She shook uncontrollably, great racking sobs tearing through her body. She had hurt him. She had saved him. But the feeling of the knife cutting into his flesh would stay in her hands forever. "Easy now," Harlan said, placing a hand on her back. "You did good. He is breathing easier already." Elena couldn't speak. She just lay there, weeping into the hollow of Caleb's neck, listening to the ragged but steady rhythm of his heart. The storm raged all night, a relentless assault that made the cabin feel like a ship at sea. But inside, the crisis had passed. Harlan had retreated to the corner, wrapping himself in his bedroll and falling into the heavy sleep of the exhausted. The lamp had burned low, casting long, wavering shadows across the logs. Caleb lay on the bunk, pale and weak, but the fever heat was breaking. His skin was cool and clammy. Elena sat on a stool beside him, wrapped in a blanket. She was watching his chest rise and fall, her eyes swollen. Caleb shifted, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes fluttered open. It took him a moment to focus. He looked at the ceiling, then turned his head to look at her. "Elena," he rasped. "Here," she whispered. "I am here." He tried to lift his hand. She caught it, pressing it to her cheek. His palm was rough, but his touch was gentle. "You stayed." He said, "I told you," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I am not running anymore." Caleb looked at her mouth. He saw the slight bruising on her lip where the leather strap had rubbed. He reached up and traced the line of her lip with his thumb. "I am sorry," he said. "Sorry." She laughed, a brittle, watery sound. "You almost died. I had to cut you. I am not afraid of pain," Caleb whispered. "I have lived with pain for 15 years. "Then what?" she asked. "I was afraid of losing you," he said. "When the fever took me, I wasn't seeing the war. I wasn't seeing the ranch. I saw the gate. I saw you walking away. That scared me more than the knife." Elena closed her eyes, turning her face into his palm. "There is no gate anymore." "Caleb," she said, "there is only this." She stood up and moved the stool. The cabin was freezing, the draft cutting through the chinking in the logs. "Move over," she said softly. Caleb shifted painfully to the wall, making room on the narrow bunk. Elena climbed in beside him. She pulled the heavy wool blankets up over them both. She lay on her side, facing him. The bunk was so narrow, their bodies were pressed together from shoulder to knee. She could feel the heat returning to him, a healthy warmth this time. They lay there in the dark, listening to the hail hammer the roof. "I had a brother," Caleb said into the darkness. "Samuel. He was the best of us. He didn't have the violence in him. He liked to draw birds." "You mentioned him." Elena said, "I couldn't save him." Caleb said, "He was shot in a dispute over a waterhole. He died in the dirt while I was trying to stop the bleeding. I have been trying to stop the bleeding ever since." "My mother," Elena whispered back, "sang songs in Arapaho when the wind blew. She told me the wind was the breath of the ancestors. When she died, I thought the wind stopped. I thought the world went silent." "It isn't silent," Caleb said. "No," she agreed. "It is loud. And it is cruel. But sometimes it brings rain," she said. She shifted closer. Her hand moved to his chest, resting over his heart. She could feel the beat of it, strong and steady. The barrier that had stood between them, the wall of employer and employee, of savior and victim, had been washed away by the blood and the rain. Caleb's arm, the one not pinned against the wall, came around her. He pulled her flush against him. Elena looked up. His face was inches from hers. In the dim light, the scars on his face softened. He didn't look like the war dog the town feared. He looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy load. She didn't hesitate this time. She didn't calculate the cost. She didn't think about survival or payment. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was a tentative touch at first, a question asked in the dark. Caleb's breath hitched. He kissed her back, and the hesitation vanished. It wasn't the frantic, grasping hunger of the saloon customers. It wasn't a taking. It was a giving. His hand tangled in her hair, pulling her closer. Her hands explored the map of his scars, the ridges of old wounds that matched the invisible ones she carried. The desire that rose between them was fierce, born of adrenaline and survival. But it was tender. It was a reclaiming. For Elena, it was the first time a man's touch had not been a transaction. For Caleb, it was the realization that his broken body was not just a vessel for pain, but capable of offering and receiving comfort. They moved together in the small bunk, the storm raging outside forgotten. There were no ghosts in the bed with them tonight. There was only the warmth of skin, the murmur of names spoken like prayers, and the desperate, beautiful knowledge that they belonged, finally and completely, to each other. The sun rose over Wyoming with a deceptive innocence. After the violence of the night, the sky was a sheet of polished turquoise, scoured clean of dust and cloud. The air tasted sharp and new, smelling of wet sage and ozone. But the land below told a different story. The plains were battered. Gullies had been gouged into the earth by the flash floods, and the skeletal limbs of cottonwood trees lay scattered across the mud like bleached bones. Inside the line cabin, the morning light was cruel to Caleb Morgan. He sat on the edge of the bunk, his face the color of old parchment. The fever had broken in the small hours of the morning, leaving him hollowed out and shivering, but alive. The bandage on his hip was stained, but the angry heat was gone. Elena moved around the cramped space with a ferocity that bordered on aggression. She packed their meager supplies, her movements sharp and efficient. She checked Caleb's forehead with the back of her hand, her touch lingering for only a second before she pulled away to button his shirt. She was no longer the tentative guest in his house. She was a soldier holding the line. "We need to move," she said, handing him a tin of cold coffee. "The roads will be mud, but if we wait, the stiffness will set in and you will not be able to ride." Caleb took the cup, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at her over the rim. "You are bossy when you are scared." "Elena, I am not scared," she snapped, shoving his hat onto his head. "I am angry. There is a difference." She helped him stand. It was a clumsy, painful process. Caleb grunted, his weight leaning heavily on her shoulder. She did not buckle. She was small, but she had the wiry, desperate strength of someone who had carried burdens heavier than a man. She guided him out into the blinding sunshine, where Harlan was already saddling the horses. The old cowhand looked at Caleb, then at the blood-soaked bandage visible through the tear in his trousers. You look like death warmed over, Harlan observed cheerfully. I feel worse, Caleb muttered. Help me up. The ride back to the main ranch was a slow, agonizing crawl. The mud sucked at the horse's hooves, and every lurch sent a fresh spike of agony through Caleb's hip. He rode with his jaw clamped shut, sweat beading on his upper lip, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Elena rode beside him, her gaze darting constantly to the ridges and the brush, her hand resting near the pommel of her saddle. She was watching for threats. She was guarding the war dog who could no longer guard himself. They crested the final rise that overlooked the ranch valley just past noon. Caleb pulled his horse up. Harlan stopped beside him. Mother of God. Harlan breathed. The storm had done its damage. Certainly. Shingles were ripped from the barn roof, and the windmill was bent at a precarious angle. But nature had not done this. The fences of the south pasture were not just blown down. They had been cut. Wire lay coiled in tangled heaps, the posts sawed off at the base. The water trough near the main corral, a heavy oak structure that had stood for 20 years, was smashed to splinters, likely by sledgehammers, and the cattle were gone. The home herd, the 60 head Caleb kept close for breeding, had been driven off or scattered into the vast, broken wilderness beyond the ridge. Caleb stared at the destruction. He did not speak. He nudged his horse forward, descending the slope with a terrifying calmness. They rode into the yard. The silence was absolute. No chicken scratched in the dirt, no horses nickered from the paddock. It was the silence of a graveyard. Caleb dismounted near the barn, his leg buckling slightly before he caught himself on the hitching rail. He limped toward the main barn doors. There, carved into the wood with a heavy knife, were crude, jagged letters. The sap was still weeping from the gashes. Sell or bleed. Elena stared at the words. She felt the blood drain from her face. It was not a warning. It was a promise. It was the voice of Silas Grant, etched into the timber of Caleb's life. Harlan walked up behind them, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. Well, Harlan said, his voice void of its usual humor. That is clear enough. Caleb reached out and touched the sticky sap on the wood. He traced the shape of the letter B. He was here, Caleb said softly. While we were trapped in the cabin, he sent his men here. Harlan took off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. Caleb, look at me. The cattle are gone. The fences are down. You can barely walk, let alone ride patrol. We can fix the fences, Caleb said, not turning around. With what money? Harlan asked. And with what time? They will come back tonight, or tomorrow, and next time they won't just carve wood. They will burn the house with us inside. Caleb turned slowly. His eyes were flint. What are you saying? Harlan, I am saying we pack the wagon, Harlan said. We take what cash is left in the tin box. We head west. Oregon, maybe, or down to Arizona, somewhere Silas Grant does not have a reach. Run? Caleb asked. Live, Harlan corrected. There is no shame in knowing when you are beat. Son, this isn't a range war. This is an execution waiting to happen. I am not running, Caleb said. His voice was low, vibrating in his chest. I buried my brother on that hill. I built this house with my own hands. I am not letting a man in a silk suit drive me off it. He will kill you, Elena cried out. The sound of her voice, sharp and panicked, broke the tension between the two men. They turned to look at her. She was standing near the trough, her hands clenched in her skirts. He will kill you, Caleb, she repeated, her voice shaking. Look at this. Look at the barn. He does not care about the law. He wants you dead. Then he better bring more men next time, Caleb growled, turning back to the house. Elena ran to him, grabbing his arm. He winced, but did not pull away. Stop it, she yelled. Stop being a soldier for 1 minute and be a man with eyes. This is my fault. Caleb looked down at her. What? It is me, she said, tears welling in her eyes. It is because I am here. Before I came. He was just pressuring you. He was using money and words. Now? Now he is using violence because he can paint you as a fool who lost his head over over someone like me. Elena, Caleb warned. If I had never gotten your saddle that night, this wouldn't be happening. She rushed on, the guilt spilling out of her like acid. I am the poison. Caleb, Harlan was right. I put the target on you. If I leave, maybe he stops. No, Caleb roared. The shout echoed off the barn walls. Elena stepped back, startled. Caleb never shouted. Do not give him that credit, Caleb said, his chest heaving. Do not give him the power to make this your fault. Silas Grant is a wolf. If it wasn't you, it would be something else. He wants the water rights. He wants the land. You are just the excuse he tells the town so they can sleep at night while he robs me. But I make it easy for him, Elena shouted back. I don't care. Caleb slammed his hand against the barn door. Right over the carved letters. I do not care if you are the Queen of England or a girl from the gutter. You are with me, and I do not run. He glared at her, breathing hard, his face pale from the exertion. I'm staying, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a whisper. If you want to go with Harlan, I won't stop you. I will give you the horse. But I am staying. He turned and limped into the house, the screen door slamming shut behind him. Elena stood in the yard, trembling. Harlan watched her, his face sad. He is a stubborn mule, Harlan said softly. But he is right about one thing. Girl, it isn't you. It is the world. The world just hates it when a man tries to stand on his own 2 feet. The standoff lasted for 3 days. They worked in a grim, silent rhythm. Caleb, unable to ride, sat on the porch with a rifle across his lap, cleaning the mechanism over and over again. Harlan rode the ridges, bringing back a few stray heifers, repairing what fence he could. Elena cooked and cleaned, the silence between her and Caleb stretching tight as a bowstring. On the 4th day, a rider appeared. It wasn't Silas, and it wasn't the sheriff. It was a young boy, no more than 16, riding a mule. He looked terrified as he approached the porch where Caleb sat. Mr. Morgan? The boy squeaked. Caleb didn't raise the rifle, but his hand rested on the stock. What is it, son? Sheriff Brady gave me a nickel to bring this out, the boy said. He tossed a folded envelope onto the porch steps, then wheeled the mule around and kicked it into a gallop, as if he expected to be shot in the back. Elena came out the screen door, drying her hands on a rag. Caleb stared at the envelope. He leaned forward, wincing, and picked it up. He opened it with a thumb, unfolding the stiff paper. He read it once, then he read it again. His expression didn't change, but the color drained from his face completely. What is it? Elena asked, stepping closer. Paperwork, Caleb said. He handed it to her. Elena took the letter. It was an official notice of seizure from the territorial court. It stated that Caleb Morgan was in arrears on a loan of $5,000 held by the Grant Land Cattle Company. It claimed the debt was secured by the deed to the ranch. It ordered him to vacate the premises within 7 days or face forcible eviction by the sheriff. I never borrowed money from Silas, Caleb said quietly. I have never borrowed a dime from anyone in my life. They are forged, Elena said, scanning the document. Look at the date. This says you signed it 3 years ago. It is a lie, Caleb said. It is a lie with a judge's seal on it. Elena replied. Harlan came up the steps, reading the paper over Elena's shoulder. This is it. Then the sheriff isn't coming to arrest you for assault. He is coming to evict a squatter. If you fight him, you are shooting at the law. They will hang you, and they will feel righteous doing it. Caleb crumbled the paper in his fist. He looked out at the empty pasture. He had been ready to fight gunmen. He had been ready to hold the gate against a siege. But he didn't know how to fight a piece of paper. We have to go to the judge, Harlan said. Judge Halloway. Silas has dinner with Halloway every Sunday, Caleb said bitterly. You heard him. The game is rigged. Harlan. Elena stared at the paper. She thought about the cell or bleed carved on the barn. She thought about the boy with the broken nose. She thought about the look in Silas's eyes, the absolute certainty that he could crush them because they were nobody. We are not the only ones, she said. Caleb looked up. What? Silas didn't just appear out of nowhere. Elena said, her mind racing. He has been buying up this valley for 2 years. Henderson at the store said he bullied the Higgins family. The widow Miller lost her farm last winter. They sold out, Caleb said. Did they? Elena asked. Or were they pushed? Were they threatened? Did they have papers like this show up on their doorstep? Caleb shook his head. It doesn't matter. They are gone, or they are too scared to talk. Fear works because people are alone. Elena said. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. You said you were a war dog. Caleb, you said you were an outcast. You think that makes you weak, but Silas thinks we are weak because we are silent. What are you proposing? Caleb asked. We go to town, Elena said. Not to shoot, to talk. We find the people Silas has hurt. We get them to write it down. We get them to sign their names. One man claiming forgery is a desperate debtor. 10 people claiming fraud. That is a conspiracy. Even a crooked judge cannot ignore a dozen witnesses if we make enough noise. Caleb laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You want to gather a posse of widows and shopkeepers? You think they will stand up for me? For us? No, Elena said firmly. I think they will stand up for themselves. We just have to give them a reason. It is suicide, Caleb said. We ride into town. Silas will have us arrested before we talk to a soul. Let him try. Elena said. If he arrests us for asking questions, he proves he has something to hide. She knelt in front of his chair, taking his rough hand in hers. Caleb, hiding has never saved me. I hid in that kitchen. I hid in the alley. I hid in my room. It never stopped them. The only time they stopped was when you stood in the street and looked them in the eye. We have to look the town in the eye. Caleb looked at her. He saw the bruises on her soul, the fear she lived with every day. And yet, she was asking to walk back into the fire. You really believe this can work? He asked. I believe the truth is the only weapon we have left, she said. Caleb looked at Harlan. The old man shrugged. It is a long shot, Caleb, but it beats dying in a shootout at the barn door. Caleb took a deep breath. He stood up, testing his weight on his bad leg. The pain was there, sharp and familiar, but his legs held. Saddle the horses, he said. The ride into Red Creek was different this time. They did not ride fast. They rode at a walk, side by side. Caleb sat tall in the saddle, despite the pain gnawing at his hip. Eliana rode a mare Harlan had saddled for her, wearing a clean shirt of Caleb's that she had taken in at the waist. She wore no bonnet. She wanted them to see her face. They passed the town limits at midday. The street was busy. As they moved down the main thoroughfare, conversation died. The silence rippled outward from them like a wave. They stopped in front of the livery stable first. Why here? Caleb asked. Mr. Abernathy, Elena said, the blacksmith. Silas's men beat his son last month. I heard them laughing about it in the saloon. They said the boy refused to shoe Silas's horses for free. They dismounted. Elena's legs felt like jelly, but she walked into the smoky interior of the smithy with her head high. Abernathy was a giant of a man with arms like tree trunks, hammering on a horseshoe. He stopped when he saw them. He looked at Caleb, then at Elena. His eyes narrowed. I don't want no trouble. Morgan, Abernathy grunted. We don't want trouble either. Mr. Abernathy, Elena said. Her voice was clear, cutting through the ringing of the anvil. We want to know if it is true that Silas Grant's men broke your son's arm. Abernathy dropped his hammer. Who told you that? It doesn't matter, Elena said. Silas is trying to take Caleb's ranch with forged papers. He says Caleb owes him money. We are going to the territorial judge, but we need to show that Silas is a liar and a thief. Abernathy wiped his soot-stained hands on his apron. You go against Silas, you get crushed, my boy. He is still in a sling. And next time? Elena asked. What will they break next time? If you say nothing. You are giving them permission to do it again. Abernathy looked at the ground. He looked at the fire in his forge. Then he looked at Caleb. Is it true? Abernathy asked. About the papers. He claims I signed a note for $5,000. Caleb said. I never took a dime. Abernathy spat into the fire. He came here offering to buy my forge for 10 cents on the dollar. Said if I didn't sell, accidents happen. Will you write that down? Elena asked. Will you sign it? Abernathy hesitated. Then he nodded. I ain't much with words, but I will make my mark. They went from door to door. It was a slow, agonizing process. Many slammed their doors in Elena's face. Some spat on the ground as they passed. But some listened. They found the widow Miller living in a small shack behind the church, washing clothes for a living. She was a frail woman with eyes hard as agates. When Elena explained what they were doing, the woman didn't hesitate. He killed my husband as sure as if he shot him. Mrs., Miller said, her voice trembling with rage. Worked him to death and then stole the deed when the heart attack took him. I will sign your paper. I will sign it in blood if you want. They went to the dry goods store. They went to the boarding house where a fired ranch hand was staying. Slowly, the piece of paper Elena carried began to fill with names. It was a list of grievances, a catalog of small cruelties that, when stitched together, painted a picture of a tyrant. But to get the last name, they had to go to the saloon. Elena stopped across the street from the Lucky Star. Her breath hitched. The swinging doors, the smell of stale beer wafting out, it made her stomach turn. This was the place where she had been nothing. We don't have to go in there, Caleb said, seeing her face. Yes, she said, we do. Tobias, the swamper. He saw Silas pay the sheriff off. I know he did. He told me once when he was drunk. Elena, Caleb said softly. She looked up at him. He was standing close, his body shielding her from the view of the street. He wasn't trying to stop her. He was just offering his strength. I can do this, she said. She walked across the street. Her boots echoed on the boardwalk. She pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon went quiet. O'Malley, the bartender, froze with a glass in his hand. Faces turned, men who had jeered at her, men who had tried to buy her. She felt the shame rise up like bile, hot and choking. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear. Then she felt a hand on the small of her back. Caleb. He was right there. He wasn't looking at the men. He was looking at the room with a bored, lethal disinterest. Where is Tobias? Elena asked. Her voice did not shake. O'Malley sneered. We don't serve your kind here. Elena. Get out before I... We are not drinking. O'Malley, Caleb said. His voice was soft, but it carried to the back of the room. We are looking for Tobias. A small, rat-faced man in the corner stood up, looking terrified. I am here. Elena walked over to him. The room parted for her. She didn't look at the men. She looked through them. She was no longer the girl who scrubbed their floors. She was a woman with a purpose. Tobias. She said, You told me Silas gave the sheriff a bag of gold coins the night the Higgins ranch burned. Do you remember? Tobias licked his lips. I was drunk. Elena, I don't know nothing. Silas is going to take everything. Tobias, Elena said, he is taking the valley. Do you think he will leave a place for you? Or will he burn this place down too when he is done with it? Tobias looked around the room. He saw the fear in the other men's eyes. He saw the way Caleb Morgan stood, hand near his gun, ready to die for this woman. He gave it to him, Tobias whispered. A leather bag, heavy. I saw it. Write it down, Elena said, producing the paper and a pencil stub. By the time they finished, the sun was setting. They had 7 names. It wasn't an army, but it was a start. They couldn't ride back to the ranch. It was too dark, and Caleb was exhausted, his limp becoming a drag. They rented a room above the livery stable from a sympathetic ostler who hated Silas's foreman. The room was small, smelling of hay and horse liniment. It had a single narrow bed and a window that looked out over the alley. Caleb sat on the bed, groaning as he pulled off his boots. His face was gray with fatigue. Elena poured water from a pitcher into a basin and brought it to him. Here, she said. Wash your face. Caleb took the cloth. He wiped the dust from his skin, then looked at her. You were brave today. He said, I was terrified. She admitted, sitting beside him. I thought I was going to be sick when we walked into the saloon. You didn't show it, Caleb said. "You walked like a queen." Elena looked down at her hands. They were stained with ink and dust. "I walked like a woman who is tired of running." Caleb put the cloth aside. He reached out and took her hands. "We have the names," he said. "Tomorrow we ride to the county seat. We find the judge." "And if he doesn't listen?" Elena asked. "If Silas has bought him too?" Caleb was silent for a moment. "Then we go down fighting, but we go down together." The reality of it hung in the room. They were standing on the edge of a cliff. The papers might work, or they might just be kindling for the fire that would consume them. Elena blew out the lamp. The room plunged into darkness, lit only by the moonlight filtering through the slats of the wall. She turned to him. She didn't want to talk about judges or gunmen or tomorrow. She wanted to feel alive right now. "Caleb," she whispered. He pulled her to him. They fell back onto the straw mattress, limbs tangling. The exhaustion that had weighed them down vanished, replaced by a desperate, frantic need. They clung to each other as if the world were dissolving outside the door. His hands were rough on her skin, desperate to memorize the shape of her. Her hands were in his hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to the earth. It was not a gentle love-making. It was intense, driven by the shadow of the noose and the gun. They moved together with a fierce urgency, a silent language of survival. Every touch was a defiance of the death that waited for them. Every breath was a claim. "I am here, you are here, we are alive." Later, lying in the dark, their breathing slowing, Caleb kissed her forehead. His arm was draped over her, a heavy, protective weight. "I love you," he whispered into the dark. It was the first time he had said it. Elena closed her eyes, tears leaking out to wet the pillow. "I know," she said. "I know." And outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the eaves, whispering that morning was coming, and with it, the reckoning. The dawn did not break with the promise of light. It broke with the sharp, cracking sound of a rifle shot that shattered the stillness of the valley. It was the hour when the world was gray, that suspended moment between the retreat of the night and the arrival of the sun. Caleb Morgan had been awake for an hour, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, watching the yard through the window. He had been expecting them. Silas Grant was not a man to let a challenge go unanswered, and the petition Elena and Caleb had circulated in town was not just a challenge. It was a declaration of war. But the shot did not hit the house. It hit the man standing by the barn door. Harlan had gone out to check the horses. Caleb saw the old man spin around, clutching his shoulder, before crumpling into the dust. "Harlan!" Caleb roared, kicking his chair back. He grabbed his Winchester from the table and burst out the back door, ignoring the stab of pain in his hip. Elena was right behind him, a heavy revolver in her hand. Another shot kicked up dirt near Caleb's boot. The gunmen were positioned on the ridge, silhouettes against the lightening sky. Cowards firing from the dark. "Get him inside," Caleb yelled, returning fire blindly toward the ridge to keep the shooters' heads down. Elena ran to Harlan. The old cowhand was groaning, blood seeping through his fingers. She grabbed him by the back of his vest and dragged him toward the safety of the tack room, her strength fueled by pure adrenaline. Then came the smell. It was the acrid, terrifying scent of kerosene. A torch arced through the air from the blind side of the barn, trailing smoke like a dying comet. It landed in the main haystack near the corral. The dry winter grass caught instantly. A whoosh of sound followed, and a wall of orange flame leaped toward the roof of the barn. "The fire!" Elena screamed from the doorway. Caleb looked at the ridge, then at the fire. The shooters had stopped firing. Their job was done. They had lit the fuse and were retreating, leaving the destruction to finish the work. Caleb dropped his rifle and ran for the water troughs. They were half empty from the drought, but there were buckets. "Start the line," he shouted. For the next 2 hours, the war was not against men, but against the elements. The fire roared like a living beast, hungry and mindless. It ate the haystack and licked at the weathered siding of the barn. The heat was blistering, drying the sweat on their skin instantly. Caleb and Elena fought side by side. They hauled buckets until their arms screamed. They beat at the flames with wet saddle blankets, coughing in the thick, black smoke that rolled over them, choking out the air. The sky turned a bruised orange, ash falling around them like dark snow, coating their faces in soot. The cattle in the lower pen panicked, crashing against the rails. Caleb ran to the gate, throwing it open to let them scatter into the pasture rather than burn. 3 of the calves were trampled in the chaos, and an old steer lay dead near the fence, its heart having given out in the terror. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon, the fire was dead. The barn stood, scorched and blackened on one side, but still standing. The haystack was a smoldering pile of black ash. Caleb slumped against the water trough, his chest heaving. He looked like a demon from the pit, his face black, his eyes red-rimmed. Elena sat on the ground nearby, her dress ruined, her hands blistered. "We saved it," she wheezed. Caleb didn't answer. He pushed himself off the trough and limped to the tack room. Harlan was lying on a pile of saddle blankets. His face was gray. The bullet had passed through the meat of his shoulder, missing the bone but tearing muscle and blood vessel. He had lost a lot of blood. "Silas," Harlan whispered, his voice thin and reedy. Caleb knelt beside him. "Rest. Harlan, we will get the doctor." "Not for me," Harlan gasped. "Save the land. Caleb, don't let the bastard win." The attack on the Morgan ranch did not have the effect Silas Grant had intended. He had meant to break Caleb's spirit and terrify the town into silence. Instead, the sight of the smoke rising from the valley acted as a signal fire. Word spread through Red Creek before noon. The story traveled from the blacksmith to the general store, from the wash house to the saloon. They shot the old man. They tried to burn them out. Some people, the ones who clung to their prejudices like a shield, still whispered that Caleb had brought it on himself. They said a man who lived with a fallen woman was inviting the devil to his doorstep, but others were quiet. They looked at the smoke, and they remembered the bullying of their own sons, the theft of their own land, the brutality of the attack, shooting an old man in the back, burning animals, crossed a line that even the hardest frontier morality could not ignore. 3 days later, the territorial judge arrived. Judge Holloway was a man of the old school, with a mane of white hair and a face carved from granite. He had not come for his usual Sunday dinner with Silas. He had come because a packet of letters had reached his desk in the Capitol, letters signed by a blacksmith, a widow, a saloon swamper, and a dozen others, detailing a conspiracy of fraud and violence. The hearing was set in the Red Creek Courthouse, a drafty building with warped floorboards and sunlight slicing through grimy windows to illuminate the dust dancing in the air. The room was packed. Every bench was filled. Men stood along the back walls, hats in hands. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and tension. Caleb sat at the defendant's table. He wore his only suit, brushed clean but threadbare. He looked tired, his face drawn from pain and sleepless nights spent guarding the ranch. Next to him sat Elena. She wore a simple gray dress, high-collared and modest. She kept her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. On the other side of the aisle sat Silas Grant. He looked impeccable in a navy suit, exuding an air of bored confidence. His lawyer, a slick man from the city, was arranging papers on the table. Judge Holloway banged his gavel. The sound cracked like a pistol shot. "This court is in session," Holloway boomed. "We are here to determine the validity of the lien held by Grant land and cattle against the property of Caleb Morgan." Silas's lawyer stood up. He was smooth, articulate, and vicious. He presented the documents, the loan agreement, the promissory note, the payment schedule. He painted a picture of Caleb as a failing rancher, a man whose judgment had been eroded by isolation and war trauma. "Mr. Morgan is a tragic figure," the lawyer said, pacing the floor. "He is a man who cannot manage his own affairs, and recently he has fallen under the influence of certain unsavory elements." He gestured vaguely toward Elena, a gesture of dismissal and disgust. Reverend Thorne was called to the stand. The preacher swelled with self-importance. "It is a moral decay." "Your Honor," Thorne intoned, looking at the ceiling as if seeking divine approval. "Mr. Morgan has taken a woman of ill repute into his home, a woman known to sell her affections. This relationship has clouded his mind. He fights in the streets. He defies the law. It is the natural consequence of sin." The room murmured. Heads turned to look at Elena. She felt the weight of their judgment, heavy and suffocating. She saw the ladies of the town whispering behind their fans. She saw the men smirking. Caleb shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. He started to stand, to defend her, but Elena placed a hand on his arm. "No," she whispered. "This is my fight." When it was the defense's turn, Caleb stood up. "I have no lawyer, Your Honor." Caleb said, "I speak for myself, and I have a witness." He looked at Elena. She stood up. Her legs felt like water, but she walked to the witness chair. She sat down, smoothing her skirts. She looked at the judge, then at the crowd. "State your name," the judge said. "Elena Marquez," she said. Her voice was quiet. "Speak up," the judge commanded. Elena took a breath. She looked at Caleb. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. "I'm here," his eyes said. "My name is Elena Marquez," she said, her voice ringing clear and steady. "And what is your relation to the defendant?" Silas's lawyer asked. Sneering. "I work for him," Elena said. "I cook his meals. I tend his house. And I love him." A gasp went through the room. "You admit to being a companion," the lawyer pressed. "You admit to your past in the saloon, to your life as a woman of the night?" "I admit that I survived," Elena said. She turned to face the crowd. "My mother died crossing the desert when I was 12. She said, I buried her with my own hands in the sand. My father died a year later. I was a child, alone in a territory that does not care if children live or die." She looked at the storekeeper's wife in the front row. "I washed floors until my knees bled. I sewed until my fingers were raw. And when there was no work and no food, and the winter wind was blowing through the cracks in the wall, yes, I did what I had to do." She looked at the men standing at the back of the room. "I was used by men who claimed to be upstanding citizens," she said. "Men who sit in this room today. Men who go to church on Sunday, and then came to the saloon on Monday to buy a girl who was hungry. They used my name like an insult. They called me filth, but they were the ones who paid the coin." The room was deadly silent. The storekeeper's wife looked down at her hands. A man in the back shifted uncomfortably, pulling his hat lower. "Silas Grant says Caleb Morgan is corrupted," Elena continued, her voice rising with emotion. "He says I am the cause of his ruin. But let me tell you who Caleb Morgan is." She looked at Caleb, and her eyes softened with tears. "He found me on the road in a storm. He did not ask for my body. He did not ask for my service. He gave me his coat. He gave me a room. He treated me with a respect I had forgotten existed. He is the only man I have ever met who did not want to take something from me." She turned back to the judge. "Silas Grant wants his land. He wants the water. And he is willing to burn barns and shoot old men to get it. He calls me a whore to hide the fact that he is a thief. But I would rather be what I am than what he is. I sold my body to survive. He sold his soul for dirt." She stopped. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, shamed silence. The narrative Silas had built, the story of the crazy rancher and the temptress, had shattered against the hard rock of her honesty. Caleb watched her, his heart swelling with a fierce mixture of pride and tenderness that nearly broke him. She was not a victim. She was a giant. The judge cleared his throat. He looked at Silas, who was sitting stiffly, his face pale with rage. Then the judge called the next witness, Josiah Perkins. Josiah was a clerk for the Grant Land Company. He was a small, nervous man with ink-stained fingers. He walked to the stand as if he were walking to the gallows. Elena and Caleb had not found Josiah, but the sheriff's deputy, a young man who had grown sick of Brady's corruption, had brought him in that morning, spurred by the petition. "Mr. Perkins," the judge said, "did you prepare the loan documents in question?" Josiah looked at Silas. Silas's eyes were cold, promising retribution. Then Josiah looked at Elena. He had heard her speech. He saw the way she held her head high. Yes, Your Honor, Josiah whispered. And did Caleb Morgan sign them in your presence? Josiah trembled. He gripped the railing of the witness box. No, he said. The room erupted. The judge banged his gavel furiously. Order, order. Mr. Perkins, look at me, the judge commanded. Who signed the documents? Josiah closed his eyes. I did, Your Honor. Mr. Grant told me to copy the signature from an old bill of sale. He said, Mr. Morgan was going to lose the land anyway, so we were just speeding up the process. It was over. The lie was exposed. The web of deceit Silas had spun for 2 years unraveled in a single sentence. Silas Grant stood up. His face was twisted into a mask of pure fury. He was not a man who lost. He was a king, and his kingdom was collapsing because of a clerk and a saloon girl. You lying little rat, Silas screamed. He reached into his jacket. It happened in slow motion. The glint of metal, the small, deadly barrel of a derringer. Silas wasn't aiming at the clerk. He leveled the gun at Elena. She was the one who had humiliated him. She was the one who had turned the town. Elena froze. She saw the black eye of the gun barrel. No! Caleb moved. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. The instinct that had kept him alive through the war, the reflex that was faster than thought, took over. He lunged across the small space between the tables. He threw his body in front of Elena just as the gun cracked. The sound was small, a pop like a firecracker, but the impact was heavy. Caleb jerked back, slamming into Elena, knocking her chair over. They fell to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Chaos erupted. Men shouted. The sheriff's deputies, finally waking up to their duty, tackled Silas, wrestling him to the ground as he cursed and fought. Elena scrambled up from the floor. Caleb was lying on his back. A red stain was spreading across the white shirt of his suit. High on the chest, near the shoulder, Caleb! She screamed, pressing her hands over the wound. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and shocked. He gasped, air bubbling in his chest. I got him. He wheezed. Don't talk, she cried, tears blinding her. Help! Someone help him. The doctor, who had been in the audience, pushed through the crowd. He knelt beside them, his hands moving quickly. It hit the shoulder. The doctor announced, his voice tight. It missed the heart, but he is losing blood fast. We need to get him to the back. Elena did not let go of his hand. She gripped it so hard her nails dug into his skin. Stay with me, she whispered fiercely. You promised. You said you weren't afraid of pain. Caleb looked at her. The noise of the courtroom faded. The shouting, the scuffle with Silas, the judge's gavel. It all drifted away. All he saw was her face, her dark eyes, terrified and full of love. I am here, he mouthed. I am here. Silas Grant was arrested and shackled in the courtroom, with the clerk's testimony and the attempted murder of Caleb Morgan witnessed by half the town. His power evaporated like mist in the sun. The judge ordered him held without bail, to be transferred to the territorial prison to await trial for fraud, arson, and attempted murder. The judge also issued a ruling from the bench that afternoon. He declared all claims against the Morgan Ranch null and void. He publicly acknowledged the courage of Elena Marquez, stating for the record that justice in the territory owed her a debt of gratitude. But justice was a piece of paper. Survival was flesh and blood. Caleb survived. The bullet had shattered his collarbone and torn through muscle, but it had missed the lung and the artery. He spent 2 weeks in the doctor's house in town, delirious with fever, fighting the infection that always stalked gunshot wounds. Elena never left his side. She slept in a chair. She wiped his brow. She forced broth between his lips. She fought death for him, just as she had in the line cabin, when he was finally strong enough to be moved. They took him back to the ranch in a wagon filled with straw. The return was different. As they rode through town, people did not stare in silence. Mrs. Miller, the widow, ran out and placed a basket of fresh bread and preserves in the back of the wagon. Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith, nodded to them, lifting his hammer in a salute. Even the sheriff, chastened and under investigation himself, tipped his hat. It wasn't a parade. There were still those who turned away, those who couldn't bring themselves to accept a mixed-blood woman and a scarred recluse as their equals. Prejudice was a weed with deep roots. It did not die in a day. But the silence had been broken. When they reached the ranch, Harlan was waiting. He was sitting on the porch, his arm in a sling, looking pale but stubborn. "You took your sweet time," Harlan called out, though his voice cracked with emotion. "I had to rest," Caleb rasped, smiling weakly as Elena helped him down. "I am getting old." Harlan. Summer turned to autumn. The air grew crisp, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned a brilliant, burning gold. The ranch was healing. The barn had been repaired, the blackened timbers replaced with fresh pine that smelled of resin. The fences were up. The cattle, gathered slowly from the hills, were fattening on the autumn grass. One evening, as the sun began its descent, Caleb and Elena walked up to the high ridge overlooking the valley. Caleb moved slowly, his limp more pronounced, his left arm stiff in its movement. The gunshot had left him with limited range of motion and another deep scar to add to his collection. They stood side by side, watching the light change. The sky was smeared with gold and crimson, a masterpiece of western twilight. The wind was blowing, but it was no longer a threat. It carried the scent of dry grass and cooling earth. Caleb took a deep breath, wincing slightly as the scar tissue pulled. "I have paid a high price for loving you, Elena Marquez," he said quietly. Elena looked at him. She saw the new lines in his face, the gray in his beard, the stiffness of his shoulder. Blood. Caleb listed. Broken bone. My reputation. And the last of my illusions that I could live alone. Elena reached out and took his hand. Her own hands were rough, scarred from work, but strong. "And I?" she asked. "What have I paid?" Caleb looked at her. He saw the woman who had walked into a courtroom and stripped her soul bare to save him. "You paid with your silence." He said, "You gave up the safety of hiding." Elena looked out at the vast rolling plains. "I have paid all my life just to be allowed to stand somewhere without shame," she said softly. "I paid with my body. I paid with my dignity. But today I stood in the general store and bought flour, and no one looked at me like I was dirt." She squeezed his hand. "That is worth the blood. Caleb, it is worth everything." Caleb turned to her. He lifted his good hand and cupped her face. The love he felt for her was not the fiery, reckless passion of youth. It was something harder, more durable. It was the love of two people who had seen the worst of the world and chosen each other anyway. "You are my home, Elena," he said. "Not this house, not this land. You, and you are mine," she whispered. They stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into the velvet blue of twilight. They were two damaged souls, scarred by war and poverty and cruelty. They would never be whole in the way innocent people were whole. They would always carry the ghosts of the past. But as the first stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, they turned and walked back down the hill toward the ranch house, where a warm, yellow light spilled from the windows. They walked together, their steps matching, a quiet, enduring flame in the darkness, proof that they had survived the fire and found a way to build a life where they belonged only to each other. Thank you for listening to this story of Caleb and Elena. It has been a journey through the dust and the heartache of the American West, and I am grateful you rode along with me until the very end. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If this story touched you, I encourage you to subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of love, survival, and the enduring human spirit on the frontier. Please share your thoughts in English. I read every one of them. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your powder dry.